Hi everyone, thanks for coming. We really appreciate it. I'm Holly Elmore and I'm the president of Harvard University Effective Altruism Student Group, the grad student group for effective altruism on campus, and together with Harvard College Effective Altruism, we are Effective Altruism at Harvard. So effective altruism is a worldwide social movement that has two goals: figure out how to do the most good and do it. And at Harvard, we just want to help Harvard students and the local community to do that. And we have great resources to bring to bear, like Dr. Stephen Pinker. So Dr. Pinker is the Johnstone Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard right now. He does research on language and cognition. And I'm sure you all know, he's a beloved public intellectual. He's written 10 books, most recently, The Sense of Style. And before that, the work we're going to hear about, which is based on Better Angels of Our Nature. And if that's not enough Stephen Pinker for you, you can use Genome online, which I think is the most fun part. He's very generous to the public. He's very generous to Harvard Effective Altruism. So without further ado, I present Stephen Pinker.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Harvard Effective Altruism. It's an honor to address this group. I'm going to speak to you this evening about the past, present, and future of violence. An appropriate topic because you might say that our species has a history of violence. I'm going to walk you through some of that history, beginning logically enough with violence in the past. And the simplest generalization about violence in the past is that there was a lot of it. There have been at least 6 major declines of violence in human history. I'm going to walk you through some of them. I'll discuss their immediate causes, that is, particular historical events of the era. And I'll also try to tie them together in terms of their ultimate causes, namely general historical forces interacting with human nature. Let's start with the Middle Ages. This woodcut shows you a typical day in the life in Central Europe in the 13th century. And the historical process that brought this mayhem under control is sometimes been called the civilizing process. I can be a bit more specific than simply showing you a woodcut, because data on homicides go back to many parts of Europe, literally 800 years, and historical criminologists have gathered them and plotted them over time, such as this time series for homicide rates in England, plotted on a logarithmic scale from a tenth of a homicide per 100,000 per year to 1 to 10 to 100, from the year 1200 to 2000. As you can see, there has been a massive decline in the rate of homicide in England, such that a contemporary Englishman has about 1/35 the chance of being murdered as his medieval ancestors. This is true not just in England, but in every country in Europe for which we have data. In fact, I would venture for every part of the world in which we have long-term data. And here you see Italy, Netherlands, Germany and Switzerland, Scandinavia, together with England, which is what I already showed you. This is a graph that shows the average of those 5 regions. By the way, for sake of comparison, I've also plotted the homicide rate for a sample of 29 non-state societies, hunter-gatherer and horticultural societies. So even when our story begins in the Middle Ages, we've already seen a big drop of homicide compared to the kind of society in which our species spent most of its history. The immediate cause of the civilizing process, can you hear me without this microphone? I don't want to speak into 2 microphones at once. Was identified by the German sociologist Norbert Elias in a book called The Civilizing Process, in which he argued that during the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, there was a consolidation of central states and kingdoms out of the medieval patchwork of baronies and principalities and duchies. With it, criminal justice was nationalized, and the constant feuding and brigandage and warlording of the medieval knights gave way to the king's justice. Also during this era, there's a growing infrastructure of commerce. There were money and contracts which could be recognized within the borders of the newly consolidated states. And there were improvements to the physical infrastructure of commerce, such as better roads and carts and instruments of timekeeping. As a result, zero-sum plunder gave way to positive-sum trade, and that's a theme I'll return to later in the talk. Another decline of violence can be appreciated by recalling how some of these early kingdoms kept law and by sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, such as breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing in half and then crushed down, and impalement. But in a development that's been called the humanitarian revolution, country after country abolished the use of torture as legal torture as a form of routine criminal punishment. Here you have a timeline for abolitions in a number of major countries and empires, and they were centered in the second half of the 18th century. And this is the period that I call the humanitarian revolution. Also abolished during this period was the profligate use of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. In 18th century England, there were 222 capital offenses on the law books, including the death penalty for poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. The death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished in every European country. Here we have a timeline which shows that most European countries abolished capital punishment in the second half of the 20th century. But the blue timeline, which shows the number of European countries that actually executed people, show that well before the politicians got around to striking capital punishment from the law books, their countrymen had lost their taste for putting people to death. And on average, 50 years elapsed between the last actual abolition and the time that the politicians got around to striking it from the law books. Now, the United States, in this, and as it turns out, many data on violence is something of an outlier among Western democracies, since we still do have the death penalty. On the other hand, even in the United States, the death penalty is a shadow of its former self, as you can see from this line showing the number of executions per capita from colonial times to the first years of the 21st century. Nowadays, well, at the time that this graph was made, about 40 people were executed in the United States every year, a country that had, at the time, more than 15,000 homicides per year. So it's almost a semantic question whether the United States has the death penalty. It turns out that the vast majority of prisoners on death row die of old age. Also abolished during the Enlightenment were witch hunts, religious persecution, such as burning heretics at the stake, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to think there was any problem with it. The Bible didn't outlaw slavery, and so-called democratic Athens was a slaveholding society. But starting in the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions which swelled into a flood, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country to abolish the institution of legal slavery. So we've been living through a period of 35 years in which are unprecedented in history, where slavery has been illegal all over the world. What were the immediate causes of the humanitarian revolution? Well, a plausible guess might be the rise of affluence. Perhaps when your own life becomes more pleasant because you are well-fed and you have a decent place to live, you place a higher life value on life in general, including the lives of others. Unfortunately, the timing doesn't quite work, because economic historians tell us that affluence really began to increase at a significant rate only with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But the humanitarian reforms that we've been reviewing took place in the 18th century, in which we developed fairly through. At least putative cause that at least gets the timing right would be the advent of printing literacy. Here we see that in this graph on the economic efficiency of producing a book, that there was a huge increase in how cheaply you could make a book prior to the 18th century. The book manufacture was the only industry that showed a precocious rise prior to the Industrial Revolution. That technology was put into practice, so during the 18th century, there was an exponential increase in the number of books published per decade, a kind of early version of Moore's Law. And it was in the 18th century that for the first time a majority of Europeans could read those books. That's when literacy exceeded 50%. Why should literacy matter? Well, there's another name for this era. It's also called the Enlightenment, because this was the era in which knowledge began to replace superstition and ignorance. And it's at least plausible that a literate and educated populace is less likely to harbor toxic beliefs such as that Jews poison wells, heretics go to hell, epidemics and crop failures are caused by witchcraft, children are possessed by the devil, which has to be beaten out of them, Africans are brutish and fit only for slavery, kings are granted a divine right to rule, and so on. During this era, Voltaire said, those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of ideas and people. And there is some evidence that when people consume fiction and drama and history and journalism, they get into the habit of inhabiting other people's minds, imagining what the world is like from their point of view, and that this expands their circle of empathy and decreases their taste for cruelty. Another decline of violence, in fact, another two declines of violence, concern the phenomenon of war. War used to be considered the natural state of affairs between countries. Peace was considered a momentary respite in this customary activity. The best data that we have for trends in major war comes from Jack Levy's data set on wars between great powers or involving great powers. These are the 800-pound gorillas, the states and empires in any given period of history that can project military force beyond their own borders. The most interesting of these graphs is the proportion of years in which the great powers fought each other. That is, when you have two behemoths on each side, what we would today call world wars. And they're significant because, in general, because of the way deaths in wars are distributed, one big war kills more people than lots and lots of little wars combined. And so the wars that great powers tend to get embroiled in account for a large majority of the deaths from all wars. So they're a good proxy for the human cost for war in general. So this is the percentage of portion of years for each 25-year period in which you had a war with a great power on each side. As you can see, it goes from 1500 to 2000. In the 16th century, the great powers were pretty much always at war. That was what great powers did. And now the great powers are pretty much never at war. The last one took place in 1953 in Korea between China and the United States. This graph shows that wars have been getting shorter over 500 years. History used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. The 20th century has the 6-Day War. Here we have the frequency of wars involving a great power. And as there were fewer countries, there were fewer wars between countries over this 500-year period. But here's a graph that goes in the opposite direction for most of this 500-year period. Namely, once a great power did pick a fight that ended up in a war, how many people was it able to kill per country per year? And because of advances, if you want to call it that, in weaponry and in military organization, wars got deadlier and deadlier up until the end of World War II, in which case the number of deaths per country year of war declined as well. So we've been living since 1945 through a period in which wars have been simultaneously getting shorter and less frequent and, crucially, less deadly. Now, if you multiply those together to actually tally out the number of people killed in wars, you get a kind of zigzag, but one whose lowest point is in the last 25 years of the 20th century. This period has data that are finer grained. You can plot the deaths in war for the world as a whole and year by year instead of quarter century by quarter century. So here you have a view of the 20th century extending into the 21st. And there's no mistaking the two horrific spikes of bloodshed that correspond to the two world wars. But contrary to many predictions in the wake of World War II, namely, this was just the beginning of a series that would get worse and worse and worse. There hasn't been one since, and you see this kind of wrinkled carpet 50 years after. And we'll now zoom in on those. I'm going to discuss the two developments separately. One of them is, has been called the long peace, referring to the fact that since 1946, there's been a historically unusual decline in interstate war. These are wars with a government on each side. One country declares war on another. In fact, the most interesting statistic from this period is zero, because zero describes the number of wars that took place between the two greatest superpowers of all, the United States and the Soviet Union. And contrary to every expert prediction, they never met each other on the battlefield. No nuclear weapon has been used since Nagasaki. And again, contrary to every expert prediction. In fact, I'll relay an anecdote. 40 years ago, maybe to this day, maybe in this room, I was a first-year graduate student at Harvard, and I came to an orientation session for graduate students, which was being delivered by the eminent MIT computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum. And he gave us a set of political advisories that we shouldn't study speech perception, because it would just be used by the CIA to monitor phone conversations. But after delivering all of these bits of moralistic advice, he said, but actually it doesn't matter whether you follow my advice or not, because I am, these words I remember verbatim, because I am completely sure there is not the slightest doubt in my mind that by the year 2000, you will all be dead. And that's how I began my graduate career. Needless to say, rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated. As I mentioned, there have been no wars between any two great powers since 1953, no wars between any two Western European countries, which almost seems like a banal, boring, obvious generalization. Who would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war? But needless to say, this is a highly unusual situation, because for most of European history, the major nations were constantly at each other's throats. In fact, I calculate that prior to 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. As of 1945, that went to 0. And there have been no wars between developed countries. We take it for granted now that wars are things that take place in poor, remote, backward parts of the world. But for most of human history, it was the big, rich countries that were constantly at war. And big, rich countries can afford big, destructive armies that can do a lot of damage. The other kind of war, I call the new peace. It refers to the fact that since the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s, globally, there have been fewer wars of all kinds, including civil wars and wars between poor countries. And there's been a lower, overall rate of death from war. So I'm going to back up that statement now with a stacked layer graph. It shows from 1946 until 2008 the rate of death per capita in 4 different categories of war. Here we have the rate of death from colonial wars, which tapered off to 0 as European empires divested themselves of their overseas colonies. We have the rate of death from interstate wars, country against country, and there's a spike for Korea, for Vietnam, for Iran, Iraq, but petering out. Here we have the rate of death from civil wars, purely internal civil wars, an insurgency or guerrilla force against the government, and internationalized civil wars, where some external government butts in, usually to help the country defend itself against the insurgents. So we have a kind of roller coaster in the number of deaths and rate of death in war, but kind of tapering off to a thin laminate in the first decade of the 21st century. What were the immediate causes of the long peace and the new peace? Well, 3 hypotheses were thrown out by Immanuel Kant in an essay called Perpetual Peace in 1795, where he speculated that democracy, trade, and an international community would disincentivize leaders from dragging their countries into stupid wars. And he was right 3 out of 3 times. All 3 of these factors increased in the second half of the 20th century. And an ingenious regression analysis by Bruce Russett and John O'Neill showed that all 3 of these are statistical predictors of peace down the line, holding all confounding factors constant. Also, together with these structural factors, as you might call them, there have been changing attitudes towards war. If you believe that ideas matter, if they have causal force over the course of human history, as I believe they do, there's been, in the middle decades of the 20th century, a fundamental shift in attitudes towards war. If you look at the way war was discussed up until World War I, war was considered heroic, glorious, thrilling, manly, spiritual, unselfish, a invigorating tonic against decadence, effeminacy, defeatness, and so on. I work in a building called William James Hall. I'm sure all of you have heard of William James. William James had a famous essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. And in it, you might think that he was talking about something that would be as bad as war. In fact, the point of the title of the essay is he wanted to say something that would be as good as war, because he assumed that his entire audience shared the assumption that war was inherently worthy. And he said, well, maybe we could figure out a way of channeling all of that heroism and courage and self-sacrifice without actually killing anyone. Today, he wouldn't have to make that argument, or at least if he did, he would have to choose a different title, because now the predominant attitude toward war, at least among elites, is that it's stupid, wasteful, repulsive, and cruel. When wars take place, they have to be justified in terms of it being a means toward an end of lower violence in the long term. No one says let's go to war because it's good for the young to break things and kill people. There are also been changing international norms about war, just what decent countries think they can do. Previously, war was considered, in the famous words of von Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist, the continuation of policy by other means. And it is no longer a legitimate option among respectable nation states. There's a norm, sadly recently violated by the Soviet Union, by Russia. It's violated the norm that borders are grandfathered in. Decent nations don't go about swallowing chunks of territory. But states are immortal, they may not be conquered. In fact, that is a norm that has held. No member of the United Nations has ever gone out of existence through conquest, a complete reversal of hundreds of years of history in which countries would just be wiped off the map at the convenience of bigger and more powerful neighbors. The final historical decline of violence I'm talking about, I call the rights revolutions. And this pertains to the targeting of violence on smaller scales, aimed at vulnerable sectors of the population, like African Americans and other racial minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The Civil Rights Revolution, before it even attained its fame in the heyday of Martin Luther King and March on Selma, first had to put an end to lynching. Lynchings used to take place in the United States at a rate of about 150 a year, just prior to the turn of the 20th century. That's 3 a week. By the 1940s, that had declined to 0. Non-lethal hate crimes against blacks have been in decline since the FBI was released in the period of 1996 to 2008, after the FBI first started tallying them. The women's rights revolution has brought about a little-known phenomenon, which is that the rate of rape has declined precipitously since they were first kept by the FBI in the early 1970s. There's been a 75% reduction in the rate of rape from 1973 to 2008. Domestic violence, again, a little noticed fact has been in radical decline, particularly in husbands and boyfriends beating wives and girlfriends. And the most extreme form of domestic violence of all, namely uxoricide, the killing of a wife or girlfriend, and veriticide, the killing of a husband or boyfriend, have also been in steep decline. In fact, if anything, the decline is more precipitous for male victims than for female victims, showing that the women's rights revolution has been very, very good for husbands. The children's rights revolution has been pushing back against the age-old practice of corporal punishment, spanking, smacking, torturing, canning, hiding, and so on. This is a graph showing the number of American states that allow their teachers to keep students. It's still nowhere near zero, as it would be for most European countries, but it used to be close to 100%. And in virtually every public opinion poll in the West, there's been a decline in the percentage of people, and especially of parents, who approve of spanking their children. Rates of physical abuse and sexual abuse have been in decline since data were first kept in the 1990s, and rates of violence against children at school, the number of kids who get into fights, the number of kids who are victims of crimes have also been in decline. The gay rights revolution has seen a drastic increase in the number of states that have decriminalized homosexuality. If you go back a couple of hundred years, basically every country made homosexuality a crime. Here you have both the number of states worldwide and the number of American states, which is now 100% following a Supreme Court ruling in 2004. And the animals rights revolution has seen a decline in hunting, an increase in vegetarianism, and a precipitous decline in the number of motion pictures per year in which animals were harmed. So this raises the question, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Now, one possibility is that human nature itself has changed, and somehow people have lost their inclinations toward violence. As a psychologist, I find this highly unlikely. For one thing, many declines in violence are far too recent and rapid to have been products of natural selection, which has a speed limit measured in generations. The fact that since 1945, Germany has transitioned from the most warlike civilization in history to the most pacifist civilization in history. The decline of lynching, rape, and spousal abuse all took place on the order of a few decades. In the United States alone, the rate of homicide declined by 50% in 10 years, starting in 1992. Since we know that environmental changes were sufficient to cause these declines, the most parsimonious explanation is that they suffice to explain all declines. Also, we still see violence in our own uncivilized members of society, namely children. In fact, the most violent age at life is not, as most people think, between 15 and 30, but rather it's at 2, in which the majority of children kick, or bite. They can't do a lot of damage, so we don't classify it as violence. If it was had guns, we might have a different understanding. Also, we grown-up children, especially of one gender a little bit more than others, continue to take pleasure in watching violence enacted for their benefit, such as in murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, hockey, and movies starring a certain ex-governor of California. And then there are homicidal fantasies. A couple of evolutionary psychologists, David Buss and Doug Kenrick, just asked people confidentially, have you ever fantasized about killing someone you don't like? The results are that about 15% of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. And more than 60% of women and 3/4 of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people. And what does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that 25% of men are liars. A more plausible hypothesis is one that I explored in my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is that human nature is complex, that it comprises both motives for violence and motives that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, which I stole as my book title, and that what's changed over history is that circumstances have increasingly favored our peaceable inclinations. What are the motives for violence? I don't think there is a single category of violence, psychologically speaking. I think there are a number of reasons that people may harm one another. There's just raw exploitation, the harming of a person who happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want, resulting in forms of violence like rape, plunder, conquest, the elimination of rivals. There's dominance, the competition among individuals to climb the pecking order and become alpha male, and the corresponding competition among groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy, dynamic that's studied by our colleague Jim Stanius. There's revenge or moralistic violence, the idea that not only may violence not be immoral or prohibited, but it actually might be moral and mandatory. Namely, you must grant justice by not letting a wrongdoer get away with its sin, but rather you must inflict violence on it to make him suffer, resulting in vendettas, rough justice, and cruel punishments. And then there are utopian ideologies, such as militant religions, nationalism, Nazism, and communism, which justify violence by a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Namely, if your belief system holds out the prospect of a utopia, a world that will be infinitely good forever, well, how much violence are you committed to commit to bring that kingdom of heaven to earth? Well, as much as you want. You do the math. Likewise, imagine that you unveil your scheme for an infinitely perfect world to people at large, and there are some people who just don't buy it. They just don't get with the program. Well, by your rights, how evil are they? They are the only thing standing in the way of a world that will be infinitely good forever. Well, again, you do the math. As in the old communist saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking the eggs, neglecting the fact that human beings are not eggs. Well, this all sounds pretty depressing. What do we have on the other side? What are the circuits in the brain that can push back against our violent inclinations? Well, there's self-control, circuits in the frontal lobe that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit our violent impulses, while 3/4 of the male population fantasizes about killing, a far smaller number ever acts on those fantasies, suggesting that self-control is an important motive. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's a moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that govern just what respectable people do and don't do. And then there's reason, cool, detached cognitive processes that engage in objective analysis. And I argued in Better Angels of Our Nature that over the course of history, our institutions and norms have increasingly brought out our better angels, such as democratic government, which prevents people from preying on each other without preying on the people itself. That's the democratic part. Commerce, if it is cheaper to buy things than steal them, if other people are more valuable to you alive than dead, then that reduces the incentive to harm other people. The rise of mass media, both real in the form of journalism and fictitious in movies and novels, could expand our circle of empathy, as I mentioned earlier. And the rise of education and expertise can reframe violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. And of course, that very much ties in with the theme of the effective altruism movement. Well, let me switch now to violence in the present. And one could well wonder, especially seeing that the ending date of a lot of my graphs were 2007, 2008, and so on, if the world has fallen apart and all these things have reversed in the last 5 to 10 years. Because in the last 5 years, we've had the rise of ISIS, we've had a war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, we've had shooting by unarmed civilians by police officers and some rioting in the streets, we've had a number of school shootings, and we have had the hunting of Cecil the lion in Zimbabwe. So has the decline of violence reversed since The Better Angels was written? It went to press around 2010. Well, there's a essential way not to answer the question, and that is to read the news. Because the news is a systematically misleading way to understand the world. Now, how do we intuitively assess risk and danger and levels of violence? The great psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman noted that we rely on a mental shortcut, or a rule of thumb that they call the availability heuristic. Namely, the easier it is to remember or imagine an example, the more likely that kind of event is estimated to be. That is, we use kind of the rankings in our mental search engine as a way of estimating probability. And needless to say, that is not a very reliable way of estimating probability. But it can explain why we fear things like plane crashes, shark attacks, and nuclear accidents, which kill practically no one. More than car crashes, falling down the stairs, and using a portable generator indoors, which kill lots of people. What happens when the availability heuristic is fed by the news? Well, remember that news is stuff that happens. It's not stuff that doesn't happen. There's even a saying in journalism that journalists cover the planes that crash, not the planes that take off. And there is another saying in journalism, if it leads, it leads. Well, if you combine the availability heuristic with the nature of news, you get the impression that the world is more dangerous than it ever has been, and it's always more dangerous than it ever has been. The obvious cure for these biases is data, namely how many bad things happen as a proportion of the number of opportunities, and has that proportion changed over time. And that, in an annual exercise, I update the data on the various categories of violence that I have in Better Angels of My Nature. And I'll start off with the bad news. That is that the decline in the number of wars following World War II, following the Cold War, it actually increased under the Cold War, has partly been reversed in the last few years. I'm going to put in all of these graphs a vertical line just to show you the year in which the books were closed on the Better Angels of Our Nature. This is a kind of crude indication as to whether I just happen to be lucky and catch the world at a trough and things were bound to progress toward greater violence. And so there's at least some indication of that in terms of the number of wars, and also in terms of the rate of battle deaths in wars, where you can see something of an uptick in the rate of deaths from war, almost entirely because of the civil war in Syria. Although it's also worth noticing that it wipes out about a dozen years of progress, and it doesn't even bring the world back to the rate of death in the 80s, the 70s, or the 50s. Why have civil wars increased in the last 3 years? Well, there are basically three reasons. One is jihad, another is Putin, and the third is Assad. Of the 11 ongoing wars, 8 of them involve radical Islamist forces on at least one side. Another 2 of them take place in Ukraine as a result of separatist forces supported by the Russian government. And in terms of the human cost, Syria outweighs all of them together, even though it's just one war, but it is a particularly vicious war. As you know, a ceasefire allegedly went into effect this week, and it is, we can all cross our fingers, if it holds, that would be a major return to the downward trend in deaths from wars. Now for the good news, which is that that's the only bad news. I'll start off with a latest development of about 3 weeks ago. Here you have the Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos shaking hands with the leader of the FARC, the communist guerrillas in Colombia, mediated by Raúl Castro. And with the signing of the peace agreement in Colombia, war now no longer exists in the entire Western Hemisphere, and the Colombian Civil War was also the last remnant of the Cold War, which means that war is now confined in the world to a band stretching from Nigeria through the Middle East into Pakistan, affecting about 1/6 of the world's population. Considering that the entire world used to be a war zone, including Western Europe, including Southeast Asia, the fact that an entire hemisphere is now free from war is at least a major symbolic achievement. And in honor of this, I was fortunate to co-author an op-ed in the New York Times with the President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, in which we pointed out the significant nature of this milestone. The number of interstate wars, traditionally the deadliest form of war, continues to be 0. That is, the last interstate war was the American-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. The number of democracies has, or at least the some democracy score across the world, despite obvious setbacks in Turkey and Russia and Venezuela, but nonetheless has continued to rise, and we continue to be in the midst of a third wave of democratization. I mentioned that the United States is an outlier in among industrialized democracies in having the death penalty. Since I wrote The Better Angels, the five more states have abolished the death penalty, and the rate of executions has gone down. A number of experts are predicting that the American death penalty is itself on death row. This is continuing a worldwide trend. Here you have the number of countries that have abolished capital punishment, and the trend since The Better Angels came out has been toward continuing abolition. There was Christoph Heinz, the United Nations Commissioner of Human Rights, noted that if current trends continue, not that he's predicting that they will, by the year 2026, capital punishment will be eliminated globally. The rate of homicide continues to decline. Here we have the United States. I mentioned that the American homicide rate fell by 50% in less than a decade. After 2011, there was a further decline, and as best we can tell, the rate of homicide worldwide seems to be declining. Despite a lot of publicity on terrorism, both in the United States and in Europe, despite a spike in 2015, continuing to 2016, overall, here you have Western Europe, sorry, the label fell off the graph, which shows that even with the bananas horribleness of 2015, when there were attacks in Paris and Brussels, so there definitely was an increase, but it doesn't even take the world to the level, in Western Europe, I mean, to the level of 2005 with Madrid and London, to say nothing of the glory days of the Baader-Meinhof and the Red Brigades, the Irish Republican Army, the Basque terrorists, and so on. The black line shows the rate of death of terrorism in the United States. 9/11 is literally off the charts. There's never been a terrorist incident before or after with that order of magnitude of deaths. Here we have a slight increase in American terrorism deaths in 2015, but again, lower than they were in the past. Hate crimes, despite publicity about some horrific ones, continue to be in decline. Here you have hate crimes against blacks, against Jews, against whites, against Asians, and against Muslims. Despite concern about a rise in Islamophobia, there was a one-time rise after 2011. But in fact, the number of hate crimes against Muslims is in fact lower than against whites, Jews, or blacks. Not that any of it is what we call abuse, but you get a very different impression when you look at data compared to the headlines. Violence against women continues to decline, both intimate partner violence and rape and sexual assault. Violence against children, despite the school shootings and the bullies and cyberbullies and so on, continues to decline. Violent victimization of schools, including bullying, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. The decriminalization of homosexuality has continued. A number of countries have decriminalized it in the last 5 years. And finally, getting back to Cecil the Lion, the popularity of hunting in the United States continues to decline. So just to sum up recent trends in violence, Assad, radical Islamists, and Putin have erased 14 of the last 24 years of progress in the decline of civil war. All other declines have persisted or continued, including interstate war, democracy, homicide, capital punishment, violence against women, violence against children, violence against homosexuals, and violence against animals. So now let me just end with a few speculative remarks on the future of violence. Now, the late James Q. Wilson used to say that social scientists should never try to predict the future. We have enough trouble predicting the past. And speaking of angels, it's said that fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and certainly predicting violence in the future would be just such territory. On the other hand, I'll just point out some facts that may be relevant in pondering the future. One of them is that some forms of violence, once abolished, stay abolished, pretty much. Human sacrifice, throwing a virgin into a volcano to placate an angry god to get good weather. Once all the ancient civilizations got over that idea, it hasn't made a comeback. Cannibalism, infanticide as a method of birth control used to be, according to one estimate, about 15% of pregnancies were ended by the newborn being killed. Harems, eunuchism, chattel slavery, dueling among men of honor, and debtors' prisons have kind of left the world stage, and I don't think we can expect them to return. And public torture executions, burning in the stake, breaking the wheel. This means that it is not utopian to imagine that there are other categories of violence which could disappear, not particularly well, but it would not be, I don't think it is naive or romantic to imagine that interstate wars between countries, could go the way of dueling and slave auctions. There are only 190 or so players, and all it would take is for there to be a craze that swept the world that just said that that's not something that countries do anymore, and for 190 so leaders to sign on for that to happen. As I mentioned, war in the Western Hemisphere has been, at least as of now, abolished. It might stay abolished. Forms of violent corporal punishment, capital punishment, corporal punishment, and punishment of victimless acts. I mentioned that the criminalization of homosexuality seems to be an inexorable worldwide trend, and it could become universal. We're starting to see a pushback against the punishment of drug possession, and I can imagine that gaining momentum, and prostitution following a resolution of Amnesty International that should not be criminalized. There are other categories of violence that may not be abolished outright, in fact almost certainly will not be, but where there's a considerable scope for further declines. Homicides and other violent crimes within affected states, that is, outside zones of anarchy, could continue to decline. In fact, at a conference sponsored by the World Health Organization and the University of Cambridge last year, a plan was outlined that could reduce the rate of violence by 50% in 30 years. Violence against women globally, there have been declarations that every country has signed on to, that violence against women is an atrocity that ought to be reduced, including domestic violence and rape. Violence against children, such as child abuse and bullying. There are other categories, though, which may not decrease anytime soon. Although I said that it's conceivable that civil wars will go the way of slave auctions, that is less likely to happen in the case of civil wars. All you need is a group of disaffected young men with access to weapons, which is pretty easy, to form the Popular Front for the Liberation of whatever, and you can have a civil war, and there's no shortage of grievances worldwide and no shortage of weapons. One expert on trends in war called the period of 2014 to 2015 that I indicated in that neither a blip nor a trend. That is, it's unlikely to be reversed anytime soon, but it's also unlikely to undo the massive decline of civil wars following the Cold War. So, and also the long-term economic and demographic trends are positive. On average, countries that are richer and better educated and healthier tend to have a lower probability of falling into a civil war, and all of those trends are continuing. The world is getting richer, getting longer lived, getting better educated. Human rights in the Islamic world, there seems to be very little positive movement there, although, and I can't help but inject one note of optimism. The last countries to abolish slavery were Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Mauritania. And a pessimist 40 or 50 years ago could have said, well, this is an institution that has been in place for millennia. It was for a long time integral to the economies and the cultures of these countries. But although it took a bit longer for these countries to abolish slavery, abolish it they did. And it is possible that there is a notion of progress that is perhaps spearheaded by Denmark or Norway, then the Western Europe tags along, then the northern and coastal American states, then the southern states, then Latin America and Asia with sub-Saharan Africa and the Islamic world pulling up the rear. But nonetheless, the global movement in a lot of these measures seems to be in that direction, which pulls out the hope that the oppression of the civil liberties in Muslim countries might be pulled by this global trend. Also, I don't imagine any decrease in cheap, low-debt, high-publicity violence anytime soon. The fact that you can become an instant celebrity, perhaps a posthumous one, if you get a gun and kill a lot of innocent people, that is just an irresistible temptation to a small but highly publicized sector of humanity. If you have either a political cause or if you're just a nobody and you want to, as we say, make a difference, then one way, guaranteed way of making a difference, of becoming famous, not being a nobody anymore, is to kill a bunch of innocent people. That will get you in the news, and that is a temptation that I don't think will go to zero anytime soon. It's terrorism and rampage shootings. So finally, the biggest question of all is, why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Is there a common dynamic that has caused all the violence reductions in the past and that might be thought, hoped to propel further reductions of violence in the future? I think there might be, which is that violence is what game theorists might call a social dilemma. Namely, it's always tempting to an aggressor to exploit a victim, but the damage done to the victim always outweighs the gain enjoyed by the aggressor, since over the long run, victims can become aggressors and vice versa. Everyone really would be actually better off if they all agreed to endure violence. The dilemma is, how do you get the other guy to refrain from violence at the same time as you do? Because if you beat your swords into plowshares, but the other guy keeps his swords as swords, then you could find yourself at the wrong end of an invading army, or otherwise be a punching bag or a doormat. It's not implausible to think that over the course of history, human experience and human ingenuity have gradually been solving this problem, how you get multiple parties to refrain from violence at the same time, just as we've made inroads against other scourges of the human condition, like pestilence and hunger. What the various violence reduction measures have in common is that they all increase the material, emotional, or cognitive incentives of all parties to avoid violence simultaneously. If so, violence reduction might be like other kinds of technological progress, namely not linear, not inexorable, but highly likely over the long run. Whatever the causes, I think that the historical declines of violence rehabilitate the ideals of modernity and progress, and they're cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that make them possible. Thank you very much. Take some questions? Yes.
One of the drivers of the decline in violence perhaps was improvement in different via economics and technology. We're facing potentially a challenging situation in the world with climate change. And I wonder if you might reflect a bit on the stress that imposes on civilization, and whether you could predict continued decline even in the face of it.
Yeah, a couple of things. One of them is whether, of course, climate change will be mitigated, whether the world will accelerate the measures that have already begun to decarbonize the economy so that they will continue to enjoy economic growth without damaging carbon emissions. So that, of course, is a big unknown. In the more pessimistic projections where the world doesn't act in time, it's questionable that there will be a great increase in human misery if climate change is not mitigated. It's not as clear that it will lead to organized violence in the form of war. But studies that look at environmental stress find a not very good correlation between environmental stress at time 1 and war at time 2. And people can be very unhappy and worse off without necessarily organizing themselves into militias that fight each other. So it's possible. It would be foolhardy to say that it can't happen, and there are lots of reasons to prevent excessive climate change other than war. But I don't think that war is
What would you make of the fact that the total number of refugees currently is the highest it's ever been? How does that fit into your understanding?
Well, one is that it's not true. The number of refugees is higher than it's ever been. That's actually, we actually don't have any data on number of refugees since the Second World War. And in fact, there have been periods such as the wake of the Second World War in which there were massive refugees throughout Europe. And in the partition of India and Pakistan, in which there were literally millions of refugees. So it's one of those claims that's often repeated but actually doesn't have any data behind it, which is not to say that it isn't a horrific situation, because it is a horrific situation. There's a great deal of human suffering, but there is no good evidence that it's actually the worst that it's ever been, even though it is horrific. So I'm not sure what your question is. I mean, it's a terrible thing, but
I'm quite skeptical of myself, but there's certainly been upward trends linked to climate change, and there's also the kind of blurring of the definitions of economic migrants and refugees and so on. And I just wondered whether you're, to the extent you have knowledge of these trends and how they relate to what you
it's true that there is a blurring of the category of economic refugees and people displaced by war. The largest category of displaced persons certainly because of the Syrian civil war. So if that settles down, again, I'm not even an optimist about most things. I'm not an optimist that that's going to settle down anytime soon. And that would, in part, reduce the number of refugees. The number of economic migrants will depend a lot on how quickly the economic development takes place in the developed world. There has been a massive progress that most people are aware of, not just people, just people in general, according to surveys. It's now estimated that the rate of extreme poverty, according to the World Bank definitions now, has fallen down to 10% of the world's population. That's still 700 million people. That's a lot of desperately poor people. But the trend has been down, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal regarding extreme poverty is to bring to zero by 2035, where most people, if that succeeds, most people in this room will be alive to celebrate it. So I hope we'll celebrate it. And in which case that would change the slope of the economic gradient that prompts many people to leave Asia and Africa for Europe, even without any war. So those are the two, I would say, global economic development and the Syrian civil war are the most hopeful signs in terms of reducing the number of refugees. Yes?
You talked about the tendency sort of recently towards the smaller and less formal forms of war. I guess maybe in that band, but one step a little smaller, there's sort of still armed conflict oftentimes. I'm thinking of like gang violence in Mexico, or perhaps small violent outbreaks between armed groups in like DRC and Eastern DRC and other places. Maybe in your data on like rape and homicide, it still reflects that in some everything's going down. But is it possible in your mind that these types of even less formal and smaller conflicts have actually gone up in some countries?
Well, gang violence has gone up in some parts of the world, in the border regions of Mexico, in Honduras, in Guatemala. Although it's not a consistent trend, because whenever there is a contraband economy, there is an increase in gang-related violence, including the United States in the Prohibition years. If you look at the rate of homicide in the United States over the course of the 20th century, there's a huge increase in the 1920s. And at 1933, the bottom fell out of violence until it went back up again in the 1960s. Most likely attributable to the Prohibition. And likewise, it's the contraband drug trade that fuels a lot of the violence in Central America. Central America, by the way, being the Central America and Northern South America, Colombia and Venezuela, are kind of the murder zone of the world, together with southern sub-Saharan Africa. So the war zone of the world and the murder zones are actually different. The war zone goes from Nigeria to Pakistan. The murder zones are Southern Africa and Latin America, Northern Latin America. even there though, in particular cities in which the government and civic society leaders have put their heads together and said, let's do something about the high rates of gang violence, there can be dramatic reductions. In San Pedro Sula, which was the most violent city in the world, there's been a 75% reduction in just the last 3 years. We don't know whether it will hold. But in countries like, in cities like Medellin, in Rio de Janeiro, and in Bogota, there have been dramatic declines. So these are, I think, one big lesson from both gang and individual homicides is that these are not permanently intractable problems. Although there are other parts of Latin America in which they have not come down and indeed have gone up. But those are all solvable problems. Yeah.
You mentioned the bias of the news. Is there any indication that some forms of violence, like domestic violence, rape, are going down, in fact, because of perception that they're going up? And if so, is there some argument that people should keep listening to the news?
Yeah. I think there is. It's a good question. I don't think we know the answer. That certainly the fact that the problem is brought to people's attention, whether or not the reporting is the sign of that particular measure is going up or going down. And certainly bringing it to people's attention is a prerequisite to eliminating it. That kind of problem-solving mindset that I mentioned. And one would, I don't know what the trade-off is between giving a category of violence enough publicity so that people are motivated to do something about it and pay for what has to be done, versus leading people to think that a problem is so intractable that you would just be throwing money down a rat hole to deal with it. There's some evidence that goes in each direction. People who consume a lot of news tend to be pessimistic about the state of the world. They tend to be sometimes cynical about whether problems can be solved. They sometimes tend to avoid the news. They sometimes tend to support demagogues who have simplistic solutions. I won't name any names. So I think there is a trade-off, and I think the news coverage, because so much news coverage is so politicized, you have your right-wing newspapers and your left-wing newspapers. Over the course of the summer, because the politicization of violence has been spearheaded by Donald Trump, for the first time in a long time, we have a mainstream left of Central American press emphasizing how rates of violence have come down. For the first time since I've been interested in the topic, and it's now kind of an anti-right trope or a talking point instead of an anti-left one. And there's been concern that since the scrutiny of police practices in the wake of Ferguson, that police have been less aggressively keeping law and order, and as a result, that there may have been an increase in 2015 and 2016 in homicides in the United States. I don't have those data there because the FBI have not released data for 2015 yet, let alone 2016. But there's some reason to think on a city-by-city basis that there has been an uptick, but not nearly enough to outweigh the decline from the 2000s or the 1990s. But anyway, the general issue of how ought violence be reported so that people are aware of it when it happens, but also aware of the fact that it can be reduced and of successful methods for reducing it is a profound question. Answer. Yes?
As far as the future of violence goes, what are your thoughts and predictions on how the global arms race for artificial intelligence will affect the trend of violence?
Those are two different things. Oh, you mean the global arms race in artificial intelligence?
Yes.
I don't think that we could tell. In general, the availability of arms tends to not be a very good predictor of subsequent war. So it is not the case, as we all used to believe in the 60s, that if you have armies with lots and lots of weapons, then they will feel the urge to use them, and that itself will lead to increased chance of war. That doesn't seem to against the money for all kinds of reasons, but they don't seem to be the causes of war. I don't think that it will lead to an increase, and it could, to the extent that collateral damage is reduced, that horrible euphemism, it could lead to a decrease. As we're seeing, as horrible as drone warfare is, the number of deaths, in particular the number of unplanned deaths, is far lower than in the age of artillery and search and destroy missions and aerial bombardment, which were just visited massive destruction on entire towns, villages, cities, and led to much higher death rates. So, in general, since it hasn't affected at all, best effect of all, of course, would be if they're never used in the first place. If they are used, they're going to probably be more positive than negative.
Let's have one more.
Someone have their hand up for a while? Who had their hand up the longest? Be honest. I'm going to ask you arbitrarily.
Some barbaric civilizational practices, like public corporal punishments, have been making a comeback under ISIS. Does that not count because those places are under civil war, or is there any larger risk of localized backslides in civilization in this way?
Yeah, so you're right that a number. One of the reasons that ISIS is considered so barbaric is that it has reproduced practices in their little pseudo-statement that were abolished by the rest of the world a long time ago. Since the so-called Islamic State itself appears to be more of a, and since ISIS is extraordinarily unpopular in everywhere, including the Arab world, including the Muslim world, it's almost certainly not a harbinger. That is, you're not going to find other countries emulating ISIS, particularly if ISIS ceases to exist. But even if it doesn't cease to exist, I don't think Jordan saying, or Indonesia saying, hey, let's be more like ISIS. The popularity of ISIS is extremely low in the Muslim world.
So on that happy note, let's thank Dr. Finger for